Shift 5 and 6, me, Mr. A, back with carrying on with Oversea Understone and the continuation of chapter 14. Right, Barney about to go into this cave, into the narrow bit with his candle. Barney went down on his hands and knees and crawled into the dark opening beneath the wedged rock, holding the dangerously flickering candle in front of him. The draught seemed to be stronger now. The rock brushed his body on all sides, so that he had to keep his head down and his elbows in, and for a moment he almost panicked with the sense of being shut in. But before the panic could take hold, the shadows looming round the one point of light changed their shape, and he raised his head without hitting the rock. He crawled a little farther, the floor rough and gritty under his knees, and found not only that he could stand upright, but that the cave was much wider. The pool of light cast by his carefully guarded flame did not even show the walls on either side. "Are you all right?" Simon's anxious voice came muffled through the opening behind him. Barney bent down. "It's okay, it widens out again here. That must be the entrance. I'm going on." He felt the line at his waist tighten as Simon jerked an answer, and he set off slowly across the cave. The darkness opened before him in the small light from his inch of candle, already burning down and dripping hot wax over his fingernails. When he glanced back over his shoulder, he could no longer see the entrance from which he had come. "Hello?" Barney said tentatively in the darkness. His voice whispered back at him in a sinister, eerie way, not booming, but reverberating round as it had in the narrow tunnel-like cave, but also muttering far away high in the air. Barney swung round in a circle, vainly peering into the dark. The space round him must be as big as a house, and yet he was in the depths of Kamare Head. He paused, irresolute. The candle was burning down, soft between his fingers. The thought of the towering dark man in his strange empty house came back to him suddenly, and with it all the feeling of menace that surrounded their pursuers, the enemy, who so desperately wanted to keep them from finding the Grail. Barney shivered with fright and sudden cold. It was as if they were all around him in the silent darkness, evil and unseen, willing him to go back. His ears sang. Even in the great empty space of the cave he felt that something was pressing him down, calling him insistently to turn away. "Who are you to intrude here?" the voice seemed to whisper. "One small boy, prying into something that is so much bigger than you can understand, that has remained undisturbed for so many years. Go away, go back where you're safe. Leave such ancient things alone." But then Barney thought of Great Uncle Merry, whose mysterious quest they were following. He thought of all he had said right in the beginning, of the battle that was never won but never totally lost, and although he saw nothing but the shadows and the blackness all around his small lonely pool of yellow light, he suddenly had a vivid picture of the knight Bedwin, who had begun it all when he came fleeing to Cornwall from the east. In full armour he stood in Barney's mind, guarding the last trust of King Arthur, chased by the same forces that were now pursuing him. And Barney remembered the story that Bedwin had buried on Kamare Head, perhaps directly above the cave where he stood, and he was not frightened. There was friendliness round him in the dark now, as well as fear. So Barney did not turn back. He went on, sheltering his small dying light, into the dark that gave back in whispering echoes the sound of his own steps. And then, above his head, he became aware of a noise stranger than anything he had ever heard. It seemed to come from nowhere, out of the air, a husky, unearthly humming, very faint and far away, yet filling the whole cave. It wavered up and down, high and low, like the wind that sings in the trees and telegraph wires. As the thought flickered through Barney's mind, he held the candle up and saw that over his head the roof opened into a kind of chimney, rising up and out of sight. He thought for an instant that he saw a point of light shining down, but his own light dazzled his eyes, and he could never be sure. And he realised that the noise he could hear was the wind far above, blowing over the hole in the rocks that they had found that morning. The singing down in the cave was the singing of the wind over Kamare Head. It was almost by accident, as he was looking up, that he saw the ledge. It jutted out from the rocky side of the chimney at the end of the cave, a bump of rock beneath a hollow, like a kind of natural cupboard, just within his reach. Inside it he saw the glint of candlelight reflected back from a shape that was not part of the rock. Hardly daring to breathe, he reached up and found his hand touching the side of something smooth and curved. It rang beneath his fingernail and the sound of metal. He grasped it and took it down, blinking at the dust which rose from the ledge as he did so. It was a cup, heavy and strangely shaped, swelling out from a thick stem into a tall bell shaped, like the goblets he had seen pictured in his books about King Arthur. He wondered how the artists could have known. He could hardly believe that this, at last, must be the Grail. The metal was cold in his hand, dusty and very dirty, but with a dull golden sheen underneath the dirt. There was nothing else on the ledge. The candle flickered suddenly. The wax felt soft and warm, and Barney guessed with a shock that it would burn only a few moments more before he would be left alone in the dark. He turned away from the ledge to the direction from which he had come, and realised how lost he would have been without the line tied to his waist. The vast round chamber of the cave stretched out all around him into the dark. Only the line, straight and thin, told him the way to go. He walked towards it. The line dropped to the ground and then drew taut again. Simon must be pulling it in. Barney clutched the Grail to him with one hand and held up the candle, now almost burned away, with the other. Excitement bubbled away any of the fears he had felt before. "Simon!" he called. "I've found it!" There was no answer but his own voice, whispering back at him from the empty cave. "Found it! Found it!" A dozen voices, each his own, from every side, and the light flickered and went out. The line stayed taut as Simon put his hand on it and walked slowly forward. "Simon?" he said uncertainly. Still there was no answer. For a moment he saw in his mind a terrible picture of Simon, overpowered and helpless, and on the other side of the narrow passage in the rock, the tall, sneering figure of Mr. Hastings, taking in the line as if he were playing a fish on a hook, and waiting. Barney's throat felt suddenly dry. He held the Grail tighter to him in the darkness, his heart thumping. Then he heard Simon's voice, low down in the darkness before him and very muffled. "Barney? Barney?" Barney put out his hand and felt the rock where the roof dropped suddenly to the narrow part of the cave. "I'm here, Simon! Simon, I've found it! I've got the Grail!" But all the muffled, urgent voice said was, "Come on out, quick!" Barney went down on his hands and knees, wincing again at the pressure of the sharp edges of the rock. Carefully he crawled into the crevice that separated the two parts of the cave, bumping his head in the dark on the low, uneven roof. He held the Grail upright before him, but it knocked against the side of the rock and rang out, to his surprise, with a long musical note, and clear and true as a bell. He saw a dim glow of lighting at the farther end of the crack, and then the bright star of a match, and Simon crouching low and pulling in the line with his free hand. The shadows made his eyes look big and dark and alarmed. He stared as Barney emerged, forgetting everything at the sight of the tall cup. Simon had been growing more and more anxious, and only the feel of Barney still moving at the other end of the line had stopped him from squeezing through the narrow gap himself. He had stood alone in the dark, straining for every sound, longing for light, but forcing himself to keep the 6 remaining matches in his pocket for the journey back. It had seemed a very long time. He took the cup from Barney's hands. "I thought it would be a different shape somehow. What's this inside? Where? Look!" Simon felt inside the cup and brought out what looked at first to be a short stick, almost as dark with age as the cup itself. It had been wedged between the sides, and Barney had not seen it in his haste. "It's very heavy. I think it's made of lead." "What is it?" "A kind of tube, like the telescope case, only a lot smaller. It doesn't seem to unscrew, though. Perhaps it just fits together." Simon pulled experimentally at the tube, and then suddenly one end of it came off like a cap, and wound in a roll inside. They saw something very familiar indeed. "It's another manuscript." So that's what he meant when he said—" Simon broke off. He had taken hold of one end of the rolled parchment in an attempt to pull it out of the tube, and the edge had crumbled away at his touch. With sudden caution he jerked his hand away, and in the same instant remembered why he had called so anxiously for Barney to come out. "We can't touch it, it's too old. And Barney, we've got to get out as quick as we can. Jane gave 3 pulls on the line just before you came back. The tide must be coming in. If we don't get out soon, we shall be cut off." As the boys disappeared into the mouth of the cave, Jane had settled herself to lean against the lone standing rock, amongst the wet pillows of seaweed and the grey-green sweep of flat granite causeway round the cliff. She tucked the telescope case carefully under her arm. Even though she had always been with Simon when he was carrying it about, she felt a peculiar, unnerving sense of responsibility at the thought of what was inside. Gradually, she paid out the thin fishing line from the neatly wound wad in her hand. Alright, we'll be back again on Monday with probably with the end of chapter 14. We'll see how this all turns out, and when Mr. Hastings and the Withers are inevitably going to turn up. Alright, so in the meantime, have a great day everybody, take care, bye bye.